Welcome, everybody, to episode number 2 of season 2 of Chapter Select, a seasonal podcast where we bounce back and forth between a series of games exploring their evolution, design, and legacy. For this season, we are, of course, as you can probably tell by the name of the episode, we are covering the God of War series. Today's episode is all about God of War Ascension, so we're going to do a deep dive on the last game in the series that appeared on the PlayStation 3 before the reboot. I am your host, Logan Moore. Joining me, as always, is Max Roberts. Hi, Max.
Hi, Logan. It's not only the last God of War game on PS3, it was the last God of War game set in Greece.
Yeah, before the full reboot. Yeah.
And it was the last God of War game and the first God of War game to have multiplayer.
Yeah, probably for good reasons. So yeah, we're going to dive into Ascension today, which is I don't know. Let's get all the explaining stuff, I guess, out of the way up front like we normally do. So once again, the game was developed by Santa Monica Studio, which is the studio that has largely always developed the God of War franchise. It appeared on PS3, released on March 12th, 2013. The game director was Todd Papy. The producer was Whitney Wade. And then the lead combat designer was Jason McDonald, who had been doing combat design stuff since God of War 2. Is that correct?
Yes, that is what my notes say, yeah. And he was the lead gameplay designer on the 2018 game.
Yeah, so he's been with this series for quite some time now. The music, the composer this time around was Tyler Bates. And on Metacritic, the game averaged an 80 out of 100 overall score, which is baffling. Yeah, like we talk about this with all the episodes that we do of this show. I feel like where we're like, man, that's a weird Metacritic score in hindsight. This one's especially baffling because when this came out, I don't remember anybody saying anything very good about this game. It was just like, yep, it's God of War. It's another one of those, and to see that it scored so highly is very, very surprising to me.
I was all in. I was on the God of War hype train. And I probably would have agreed with like an 80 Metacritic score in 2013, but Max today would not agree at all. This game is it's fascinating to say the least in both good and bad ways. It's so interesting.
I could see giving it an 8 out of 10 or something like that if you're a reviewer back then. It's more because obviously it's an average, so that means there had to be a fair amount that were higher than that and a fair amount that were lower than that for it to kind of sit in the middle there. Yeah, I'm looking at the number of publications that gave this anywhere from looks like the highest score on the internet for it was a 9.6 all the way down to an 8.5 or an 8. Yeah, that's very surprising to me because, spoiler alert, I don't think this game's very good, and we can get into talking about that. So before we get into the larger discussion about the game, though, and what we thought and its story and combat and things like that, our histories with this game. So I'll go. Normally I'd pass it off to you, but I have a very brief history with this game. I never played it, so this was one of the 2 that I believe I had never played in the series. It was this and Ghost of Sparta that I've never played. So this was a fully fresh experience for me playing it this time around for the show. You, on the other hand, I know you never finished it, but you did play, like 3/4 of it back in 2013?
Yeah, I played. So there are 30 chapters in the game, and I played up through chapter 22.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, I was close to the end. And honestly, you helped me figure this out, why I stopped playing it. It's because maybe a month later or a few weeks.
It would have been a couple weeks later, I think, yeah.
BioShock Infinite came out, and I remember buying that game too. And so when I got home from a vacation, I was playing God of War Ascension before vacation, came home from vacation with Infinite, and started playing that right away.
It would have legitimately been 2 weeks later. So this came out the 12th. BioShock Infinite was the 26th of March.
And I never went back to Ascension, which, wasn't good or bad at the time. It's just
Can't
I
blame
got
you.
distracted. You know,
Yeah.
it wasn't like I was crazy to come back.
Well,
but
a game that would have its hooks in you, I feel like you would want to go back and
also I've been notorious, especially in the high school years. I would just bounce around games. Like I didn't try to finish what I started as much like I do now. But I was definitely, I mean, Logan, I was into Ascension. I wrote a whole preview and wrote it on the blog. I got the collector's edition. I went to the GameStop for the midnight launch, and that was back in the days when they did midnight launches, like at midnight before they started bumping those up. And they actually, for whatever reason, mall security was like, we are locking this part of the building down at 9:00 and then we'll reopen it at midnight. And they're like, you can either stay in the store with the employees or you can leave. And the employees let me. So I sat trapped in a GameStop for 3 hours. I was one of 2 people there that night for God of War Ascension. Everyone else was there for StarCraft 2 Heart of the Swarm, which is also just kind of interesting to think of people at a GameStop for a StarCraft 2 expansion.
Yeah.
That's kind of funny to think about as
how
well.
far we've come in less than a decade.
Yeah. So I was in the beta. I was in to Ascension. And also it came with the Last of Us demo that wouldn't come out until...
Which it still says on the... It's one of the main prompts when you get into the menu of this game. It says Last of Us beta or whatever. It's like, that's kind of bizarre. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this came out the same day as StarCraft and Sniper Ghost Warrior 2. That's an interesting one. Anyway, so yeah, you've played a little bit of this. I have not. So we're coming at this from slightly different perspectives, but I think we both knew... I mean, we mentioned this going off the Metacritic score, but we knew coming into this one that this would maybe be one of the not as great ones in the series if we were going to play one that would be considered a stinker. And to explain how I was coming at this, though, I was very excited to play this one because it is not one of the ones that I have played. I mentioned in our last episode that I was a little less thrilled to play the original God of War again because I had played it probably twice, I think, before we did it last time. So I was not like super keen on returning to that one just because I knew about it. This one I didn't know about, so I was legitimately anticipating playing it. But yeah, wow, it's very aimless. Like this game does not feel like God of War at all. It's so strange to me.
Off that aimless point, I kind of wrote that it feels like the cutting room floor of like God of War 2 and 3 with maybe a little bit of Ghost of Sparta in there. Like it's the stuff that never made it in the other games and they kind of just glued it together. It's very mismatched, just has no purpose.
It's glued together in a lot of different ways. Like not only is the story itself kind of like just confusing, but the way it's told is also bizarre because they splice it up into different like sections and things like that, which could make sense, and I think that would make for a fine game. And I think it works to the game's benefit in the way that the opening chapter or couple of chapters are a little bit more exciting because it starts at like kind of starts at the narrative height of the game and then it slows down from there. But they don't really ever flesh out why these things are happening. Like, I understand why these things are happening in the game. Kratos is trying to turn against Ares, and he's got to, I guess, kill the Furies because it's very confusing. Honestly, they don't really explain it.
It is confusing. I wrote down, like, I don't know why I'm trying to find the Oracle. Like, who is Orcos?
Yeah.
Like, why am I doing this? And so it's a prequel. It's one of 3 prequels in the God of War series. And I kind of looked it up. I was like, because the game ends almost where it starts. Like,
Yeah.
Orcos dies and Kratos is like, I'm off, and he just starts walking away. And I'm
the
like,
one
so
cool
what?
thing to chime in on one cool thing about the ending real quick. I do like that they do the narrative at the very end of the game, like the voiceover narrative, like, and so Kratos left and he went to go fight Ares, because that's how the storytelling is all throughout God of War 1. But they don't do that until the very end of the game. And so I thought that was kind of a cool touch, because I think everything up until that point, they don't do the voiceover narrative, right? Where they're like, or the narrator is speaking and talking about Kratos and what he's doing. And
there's the prologue video when you boot up the game.
Yeah.
And then Orcos is narrating a bit through some stuff. So there is narration. It's just not, darn it, I think it's Linda something. But it's not typically Gaia's voice. I looked it up because I was curious. This game, chronologically speaking, is 6 months after he kills his wife and daughter. I'm like, all right, well, that's kind of interesting. He's taking 6 months. Do you know how far away from God of War 1 it is? 10 years.
Really?
Yes. Between this and God of War 1 is Chains of Olympus, which is 5 years after Ascension. For those 10 years, he is serving Ares and the gods.
That's weird, because he gets to the very end and he's like, oh, I will now kill Ares.
Yeah, I don't... narratively, this game's a wash. Like, it doesn't further any future plot. It doesn't bring any insight to Kratos or the world of Norse mythology, except maybe that, like, Ares banged a Fury. Like, nothing is enriched here for the world. It's very pointless.
The thing that's weird too is like the way they set up the storytelling from the outset is with that opening video, they're like, oh, before the gods and the titans, there were the whatever the people are that like created the world. It doesn't matter. Like, I'm looking at the plot synopsis here and it doesn't even mention them. So like from the outset, the game's like, oh, okay, so you've already fought the gods in 3 and you've also fought the titans. The primordials. So they set up that like this is going to be an important thing. Like, okay, you've killed the gods and you've fought the titans. Why are we taking you back to a prequel? Oh, the primordials. But like they're not in the game and nothing from them ever shows up really. It's very. The story is very obvious that this is one of the things I texted you about. It's so clear that they finished God of War 3 and they're like, we're done. Cool. Now we can close this chapter. And Sony's like, hey, you know what sold pretty well? God of War 3. You know what we would love for you to cook up? Another God of War right now. It feels like this was absolutely ordered by higher ups at Sony because they wanted to get another God of War game on this system.
I'm curious about that because it came out 3 years after God of War 3. So at the time, Sony Santa Monica was also working on another game, which ended up getting canceled, the sci-fi game. That was one that Stig was heading up before he left. And I almost feel like they did plan on making another God of War game just to kind of float until they could get this sci-fi game up because they were building something new, and clearly that didn't work out.
Perhaps, yeah.
It feels, I mean, it could have been rushed.
But even in that sense, let's say it's not a game that PlayStation ordered. It doesn't at any point feel like a game that the studio really wanted to make or was like super passionate. That doesn't come through with the game, at least to me, because
I don't think it comes through in the single player. I really feel like, and I'll hit on this a few more times because in my notes and whatnot, but I really feel like this was a multiplayer game first for Sony Santa Monica.
Because we were at
and
that
single
point,
player was an afterthought, or single player was adapted in light of multiplayer. Like multiplayer shaped this whole game.
And that would have made sense at the time because Sony was very keen on getting multiplayer projects like that out. Like if you look at the things they were releasing back in that time period, it was a lot of multiplayer stuff, both from their first party studios and from even a lot of their indie studios, or not their indie studios, but they would like publish indie games like Fat Princess or something like that. It was like a wonky little multiplayer game. Like there was a lot of things like that But yeah, they were doing a lot of different multiplayer things and ideas back at that point in time. So it would make sense if they were like, let's do this for God of War. And that was kind of the basis for the project. But that's probably not... I mean, there's a reason there's not been a God of War multiplayer game since. Like, this was a thing across the whole industry, though, because at the time we also had... what was the Assassin's Creed game that implemented multiplayer? Was it Brotherhood that did it first?
Brotherhood, I believe, started with the multiplayer trend. That was cool. That was a neat multiplayer mode.
But everybody was trying to do it at this point.
Everyone was doing multiplayer.
BioShock 2 had multiplayer in it. And
Sony was also selling online passes. That's how they were implementing the multiplayer.
Yeah.
Was through, your game came with a code. You redeemed the code, and that's how you got access to the multiplayer suite. And if you didn't have that code, you could buy it for $10. So they were trying to create an engaged community. I mean, Uncharted 2 through The Last of Us all had multiplayer. Until recently, those servers shut down. And Logan, the Ascension servers are still up. We both played a little bit. Like,
dabbled.
This game is still running.
Yeah, which is strange, to say the least, a little bit.
It is. It's baffling. So it's really hard to get a grasp on the multiplayer today because we're 8 years removed from it. And honestly, joining a game now, you're playing against people who clearly want to and know how to play this game and just beat the snot out of you. It's just not fun in that sense. So I dug up my preview from 2013.
Oh, man.
And I thought this I'm not going to read the whole thing. There will be a link in the show notes to it. But kind of the spirit of this multiplayer was you choose a god to align yourself with, Zeus, Ares, Hades, or Poseidon. And then you get different weapons. There were hammers and spears and swords. So things that you were getting in the single player and the multiplayer. Did you pick up on the multiplayer tie-in trailer in the single player campaign?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, there's
he crashes in on that dude in the prison in like chapter 3 or 4.
Yep, and that's who you play as in multiplayer, which is cute. So, you're playing this and it's typical multiplayer mode, like get the most kills or capture the flag and things like that. But then the stages would have interactive moments and you could like attack a Cyclops and who got the kill. Yeah. So they tried to make it a very God of War inspired multiplayer, which I think ends up shaping our single player experience in combat. It is the blocking, the parrying, the stunning, the grappling, all of it, I think, was multiplayer first and then applied to single player. But there was a multiplayer, man, and it's interesting. And I think it's incredible that the servers are still up as of this recording.
Yeah, I don't think they've nuked them within the past week or past couple days.
I can't wait for that blog post because, I
feel like they'll just do it, though. I don't know how vocal they'll be about it. I think if anything, Santa Monica Studio will just tweet it out because that's kind of what Naughty Dog's been doing with.
When Naughty Dog killed the PS3 servers, they killed the PS3
like, hey,
servers.
Guys, this is just happening. FYI.
But they gave everyone notice.
They did.
Clearly, the fact I could even get in a game clearly indicates that there's some form of a community. Like someone's using up the servers.
Maybe it's got to be what? Max,
super small.
A couple hundred people, if that. Maybe.
I don't disagree. I do find it fascinating.
The game is once again, you played this via your own PlayStation 3 and I played it via PlayStation Now. So there are easier ways to access this game via modern methods. And with that in mind, it makes a little bit more sense that I guess they would keep them up in perpetuity. Mm-hmm. Plus, the other thing with like Naughty Dog shutting down their servers, there's other ways to play those games online. Or at least there's similar offerings. Like The Last of Us, you can play on PS4. Or Uncharted, you just go play Uncharted 4. Yeah. So like there's similar experiences. There's nothing else that Santa Monica Studio has done that is like this. So that's probably why they were still on, I would guess. But yeah.
I did check the trophies. There's only one multiplayer trophy, but it's to complete the multiplayer training.
The tutorial, yeah.
And only 20.2% of people did it, which doesn't, like, that's pretty low. I mean, only a fifth of your player base is out there playing.
Yeah, and that's reflective of why all these games nowadays don't just get multiplayer game modes tacked on, because the proof is in the pudding right there that people don't want this stuff. No one was a God of War fan back then that was really like, you know what this game needs? Multiplayer. Somebody bake this in. It was something that Santa Monica came up with, and they tried to sell everybody on it, and some people enjoyed it and some people were into the idea. But there was not really a large vocal community of people saying, hey, you know, it would make God of War 3 better is if they had multiplayer in it. And that's why that stuff doesn't happen very often anymore, is because people just don't play it. Even with bigger games, like how many people, I'm curious what the stats would be like on a really, really mainstream game, like an Uncharted 4. Like what do the stats look like for the people that, how many people that bought that game and played the story then jumped into the multiplayer? Because I'm one of those. I don't know if I ever did, honestly. I think I played the multiplayer a little bit, but not a ton.
You tell me you didn't hop in there and get that plat for Uncharted 4?
I mean, I did at some point, yeah. But
Uncharted 4, continue the adventure, complete the Uncharted multiplayer introduction. According to PSN profiles, 16.8% of players have done so.
And that game has sold like 20 million copies, I think, or 15 to 20 million. So of that 15 to 20 million, maybe like one or two, or not one or two, maybe like 2 to 4 million, somewhere in there, have played the multiplayer, at least to the point of completing that. So even today, and the multiplayer in that is good too. Like Naughty Dog does a good job with that. So it just shows that people are not looking for these multiplayer experiences. Like the games that are going to find a multiplayer audience is going to be your Call of Duties and your Halos. I would assume Infinite will have a big audience when it releases later this year,
especially for free.
But yeah, I don't know. I don't know why. I part of me understands why they did, just because everybody else was doing it at the time, and I'm sure it was a unique challenge for the studio to come up with something. I'm sure it got their creative juices flowing to a degree. But yeah, in hindsight, like especially seeing how the industry is now, it's like, wow, this is totally baffling that they did this.
And it frankly, I could see it kind of in that line of being a creative challenge for the team. I mean, God of War's core at that time was its combat and gameplay, and having a multiplayer suite be the focus of the new game probably gave them a chance to really try and come up with something balanced and creative and challenging and technical. And it's hard to say if they really succeeded on that front, because honestly, I have a hammer. I got rocked by a hammer, so maybe hammer's the meta. Like, you know, it's hard to really capture the spirit of the game at the time, but clearly multiplayer wasn't the thing for God of War, because it's not in the new one.
Yeah.
And likely will never be in a God of, I mean, unless they make
I can't see
standalone.
Like God of War Battle Royale.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
100 Kratoses fall from the sky.
So the end of God of War 1?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, 100 people drop into Hades. Let's do that.
Oh my goodness.
Let's talk about the general gameplay of this one as well, because I know we haven't played like 2 and 3 yet in this series, even though we've played them before.
Sure.
So we know like what those games do in a general sense. The gameplay from this one, they try some different things. They add some new systems and mechanics. I mean, obviously the Blades of Chaos are still there, and it's the main way in which you're fighting enemies and stuff like that. But it feels very rudimentary. Like, it feels so straightforward. They put a larger emphasis on different types of Blades of Chaos attacks that you have, different different styles that are aligned with different gods. And then there's a couple other things you can do in there, a couple different abilities, like slow down time or create a clone of yourself, that sort of stuff. But especially like knowing, again, I don't want to compare too much to God of War 3 right now because we still haven't played that game. But I know the things God of War 3 gives you that are way more interesting and mix up combat a whole lot more. And to see them go from that to this is very, not like puzzling, I guess, but it just feels like a step backward in some regards. Did you feel the same way?
Yes.
Again, I don't want to...
Not to harp on the multiplayer element, but they poured, it seems, a lot of the effort into multiplayer. And what better way to get people ready for multiplayer than to have them use the same combat system in the single player? And so you see an emphasis on alternate weapons, which does happen throughout the God of War games.
Yeah.
Particularly like in Ghost of Sparta and, God of War 3 and 2 have some alternate weapons to a certain degree, but not like this where you've got 5 types and they have different strengths and weaknesses, kind of like a rock, paper, scissors kind of chart there. Magic is nowhere near what it looks like in God of War 1, where you have a single bar and different abilities that kind of revolve around using that bar up. This is, if you max it out, a 4-use magic bar, so just 4 chunks, and each spell, cast, whatever you want to call it, is 1 chunk of it. And with that comes those different elemental types in the blades. So the blades stay the same, but the elements you use and types of attacks you throw change from Ares to Zeus to Hades and Poseidon. Yeah. So it's this core 4, which are the 4 that you pledge allegiance to in the multiplayer. So it's all tied together, and you don't even unlock magic.
This was going to be
the 4.
Yeah, this was going to be the big thing I was going to bring up. It's like
until you max those out.
Yep.
So the only magic you could have for most of the game is the Ares type, which throws like a fireball in the enemy and then blows up a little bit later.
That was the thing that was very baffling to me about this, is that they're giving you these abilities, but they're not really, they don't do anything until you upgrade them. And they take a bit to upgrade because you obviously need the red orbs to do that. It was very strange how they were all doled out, because I didn't feel like I was gaining anything that was better or more to my style. I would have to, by the time I had all of the different styles unlocked, I was in the very late stages of the game, and I was like, oh, well, I guess I'll just stick with what I've gotten used to, like what I have been using.
And when you compare it to God of War 1, Poseidon's Fury was like this AoE type attack. Hades was the spirits. Lightning was essentially like a bow, like you could have range. Like it allowed you to mix up and alternate your play style to handle certain combat situations. And here, it just felt like
all the magic attacks are pretty AoE.
And not like I guess the most powerful one I felt was either Ares or Hades.
Yeah, those are the two I use the most.
It didn't incentivize me to use the magic. The alternate weapons, I really like the it's not a hammer, but the giant sledge baseball bat looking slugger thing.
The mace.
I liked that the most. The sling I would not want to pick up. The shield was
The shield was okay. Sword I didn't care for. Sword was the one I didn't really like at all, honestly.
Yeah.
I didn't feel like it chained well together with other attacks.
Yeah. And then the javelin was only a limited use item.
Yeah.
So they definitely tried, but I ended up just sticking with the blades as much as possible. And the blades are great. I still, even what it was 2005 to 2013, I mean, the blades were still good 8 years later.
Still good now, even though they're different.
They're still good today.
So, yeah, I mean, overall, I found it to be a very underwhelming combat system in a general sense.
I did find it to be the most, from what I remember, maybe we'll rediscover your most combo heavy. Like they really wanted you to come up with combos and chains of grapple, throw, slam.
Well, hit. And it was also very this was one of my other problems with it, though, is that it was the combat system was somewhat reliant on you building up your your rage meter. I
Yes,
think that's what it was.
Because that unlocked
unlocks other abilities that you could use. Yeah, but you couldn't ever really take a hit, or else it wouldn't get knocked down all the way, but somewhat. And some of the enemies you fight later on, like, deflect a lot of things you try to do to them. So you're right. I did feel like the early stages of the game really encourage you to, hey, mix in your grapples, mix in this, mix in that, blah, 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 blah. But you get to a point later in the game where you're facing enemies that don't even allow you to do that. And then you are just flailing your chains around as much as humanly possible, depending on the situation, or you're just spamming your magic attacks. I feel like the enemies, as the game progressed, really, they didn't encourage you to fight in the same way that you may have done so in the early hours, which was a bizarre choice.
Mm-hmm. I think an enemy that really kind of encapsulate that, at least a bit of that, is those elemental giant warriors, like big suits of armor that come down, and they'd either be one of the elements that you have.
They are straight up invincible for certain sections.
When they switch to like their heavy attack, and no matter what you do, like, so you
just have to run around and dodge it.
Yeah, and in an action game, what you want to do is hit and counter and be powerful. And this was like, you've got to run away and just wait it out, which is so frustrating because you were in the flow of just hitting him, and then they enter this phase, and suddenly you have to run. You're on the defensive suddenly, and that's not a fun feeling, especially when you're Kratos, this powerful, literally powerful character that makes you feel cool.
The other thing that really bothered me, and this was something else I texted you about, specifically when I was doing the Trial of Archimedes section, which is abysmal. It's probably one of the worst things I've ever seen in any God of War game that I can remember.
Really quick, we played on hard. We both got the plat, so we were definitely. Maybe we can talk about the difficulty balancing later, but please continue.
The thing that really started to reveal itself to me during that section, though, is that too many of the enemies in this game also don't get staggered when you hit them, which kind of annoyed me. Like, a lot of the common enemies, a lot of the ones that are humanoid in nature, they will get staggered if you hit them, so that you can kind of pull off a full combo or whatever, which I think it should allow for, because the game is putting so many enemies on the screen at once that you're not going to be able to hit them all at the same time and stagger them all more often than not. So there's always going to be, like, your back's always going to be exposed or whatever in the first place. But some of the later enemies that you start to run across, you will attack them and it will just straight up not do anything to them. Like, they don't act like nothing's happening to them. So you're trying to pull off these combos and get into a flow and deal some damage, and they're just still attacking you through it, or still doing various moves. The one thing that really annoyed me with the trial section with the Gorgons is that they could just grab you anytime they felt like it, and there was, to my knowledge, there was no way to avoid that. Like, I would try to parry it, I would try to...
my understanding is the parry is the only way, but I found the timing for the parrying to be impossible to, like, really... understand. I couldn't find it.
The parry's bizarre, like, because you have to get in your block stance and then you have to press X, but then there's like a full second between when you do it and when he actually, like...
Well, that would explain why I never was able to do it. I thought you just had to hit L1.
No, you have to hit X.
When, like, at the time, kind of like a... So that explains why I never did it.
You have to hit L1 and you have to hit X, and it brings up, like, a shield around him. But there was always a delay and this wasn't a PS Now thing, because nothing else in the game felt like this to me. But there was always like a half second to a full second delay between when you would press X and he would actually pull up the shield. So you would have to really, really read. It was like you had to do this not exactly when they were attacking. You had to, like, anticipate it a full second ahead and make sure that you were right on time. But anyway, and I would do that to some of the Gorgons with some of their attacks, but it wasn't like that with the grabs. So they could just grab you at any point and you couldn't do anything. And anyway, there are just some enemies in the game, when you are attacking them, they are not getting shook from the fact that you're attacking them, and then when they attack you in turn, it can, like, stun you, and then you're just getting wailed upon by whatever the heck is attacking you.
Yeah.
it just didn't feel properly balanced. I don't know. Like, I mean, we beat the game and it was fine eventually, but there were too many sections in this game where I just got backed into a corner and enemies would just start attacking me and I couldn't do anything because the game won't let you attack because you like you stagger or get stunned or whatever, and you can't attack through that, which is fine.
You're more vulnerable to being stunned than the enemies are.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a balance of power there. And, you know, like for some of the trophy stuff, I went back to my original save to just clean up a couple of things, like the slide through Apollo's arm and things like that.
That was annoying.
Yeah, that wasn't very fun. But the, you know, those combat encounters that I would play on normal were an absolute mindless breeze.
Yeah.
And so there was no balance there in hard mode for sure. And I can only imagine what Titan mode, which is unlocked after you beat the game,
no, thank you,
would even feel like. I can't imagine that. It must all rely on that parry timing that you were talking about.
Probably, because if you pull that off, it does a ton of damage. So, and it's really helpful if you do that.
And speaking of timing, I found the dodge to
terrible.
not feel good.
Yeah.
God of War 1 felt great, but those elemental soldiers again. One of them, I think the fire one, would send down like 3 fireballs in a row. Mm-hmm. And I'd roll and dodge the first 2, but every time on the third one, I'd get hit. And it's because his roll animation was so long. Like this, to like get out of this roll, and Logan can see me, but I'm like waving myself around.
Yes.
The roll did not feel good, which made it a poor defensive option. And then when the game forces you to go on defense in every encounter at some point, especially against big enemies, you can't win those situations. Yeah,
the roll and the dodge roll and the parry maneuver, both the animations on them are either too long or they take too long to implement. Like, this is a fast action game. Like, when you input a command, you want it to happen relatively quickly. And that was the big thing that kept annoying me with this game, is that it felt like all that stuff took. You'd use the right stick to dodge somewhere, and it took a half second to a full second until he actually did it. And it just, for how fast, in some action games, that's fine, like your Dark Souls or something, because that's kind of how Dark Souls is. You'll do your dodge, and it'll take a little bit of time, depending on how much like armor you're carrying and things like that. But in this, the whole game is fast, and you need to be able to do those things quickly. And I felt like I struggled with the game a little bit, less so because I was playing it poorly and more so because I had to adapt to weird things like that. Because I was using the moves that they gave you, but it was more so that I had to learn to adapt to how those moves in practice actually function and work, if that makes any sense.
It just didn't feel as responsive and satisfying, especially coming off of God of War 1.
Yeah.
And, you know, from what I recall, the other games too, I'm actually super fascinated when we get to God of War 3, because that's the closest to this in design.
Yeah, because I remember God of War 3 feeling 10 times better too. So to go from that to, I guess my memory of that into this, and it's just, but again, last time I played God of War 3
I'm excited to see how that shakes out.
Yeah, I haven't played God of War 3 in 6 or 7, 8 years, so I don't know if that'll be the same. I don't know if it'll still ring true, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah. What did you think of... We've talked a lot about the actual like mechanics of combat, but what did you think of the enemies and bosses?
So one thing I guess I would say about this game that I liked was the kill animations of a lot of the enemies. They looked cooler than some of the other ones, like cutting open an elephant's head and his brain spills out. That's kind of fun.
That's awesome.
But I also felt like the game was too, and this says a lot because it's a God of War game, I felt like it was too QTE heavy, like to almost a like crazy degree. Like even some of the things that it was like prompting me to do QTEs for, like the slides is a good example. You'd get to the end of the slide when you would need to jump and it would like prompt you to press X. It's like, yeah, okay, I know, I see it's ending. But maybe that was just to make that more clear that you were about to run off the ledge or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
I felt like there was too many QTEs though in the game for sure. There was instances where it would all of a sudden prompt me to press a button and I totally wasn't ready for it. I'm like, whoa, oh, okay. And I would die and I would have to restart because it just didn't seem like that type of area or that type of section where they would do that.
Are you talking about like the Gorgons, for example? Like when you press circle to grab the Gorgon, you almost engage in a mini game of / dodge the blast. Are you talking about that or the actual?
No, like actual like things that seemed like cutscenes that all of a sudden are like, go, press a button. It's like, whoa, okay. One instance of that I remember was like with the snakes when you're trying to get those to move around or whatever. Like you jump onto the side of one and you're like gliding along. You're like riding it and then it makes you jump to another one. But it didn't really convey that was something. Anyway, bottom line, I died on that. That's one instance of that I can remember at least. The enemy designs and stuff I thought were pretty cool, though. A lot of it was more, you still got your Cyclopses in this, and you got your dogs, I guess. But they mix in some different types of enemies. The bugs and the elephants and... the Gorgons are a little bit different in this one as well. They look more like cobras, which is kind of cool. But
I got an Egyptian vibe from this game.
A little bit, yeah.
Like some of the enemy types. I mean, we're not saying that cats were walking around here like to fight us, but just like the elephant and the beetles.
Yeah.
Even the satyr generals, like they just looked a bit leaner, more streamlined. It was interesting. And we know in hindsight, I mean, actually from like God of War 1 and 2,
that they
other mythologies were thought about. And Egyptian was like the other option between Norse, like where 2018 was going to go, and they ended up going the Norse route.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to kind of pick up on some of those design choices here in this game so many, almost a decade ago. Oh my gosh. It'll be 9 in a few months.
I know. We're old, it turns out.
What about the bosses?
I didn't really like most of the bosses in the game, honestly. Final boss is terrible. It's just total garbage, honestly. Like,
it just doesn't make sense.
It didn't make a bit of sense. There's all of a sudden a Fury lady who's like, oh, I can change or I guess it was the other one who could like change reality and can change the way things looked, but or maybe they could all do that. I don't know, because the one who started doing that was not the one in the cutscene that was pretending to be his wife. Anyway, she explodes into a giant kraken basically, which doesn't make a lick of sense. That fight was bad. Even outside of that though, I don't know. Some of them were okay. The dude with the 2 heads on him with the time amulet, that was okay, I guess, but it was also kind of annoying. How they mixed in some like platforming and you gotta avoid falling to your death in certain instances. The one thing that I mentioned before though that I did appreciate about the game is that it was pretty forgiving with checkpoints, because some of these fights are pretty darn long. And if I was tasked with beating them from start to finish, that would have been I probably would have restarted it on easy or something like that. So yeah, it was I think most of the bosses are not too shabby, but none of them really stand out as being ones that I necessarily loved, if that makes sense. I didn't think most of them were bad outside of the final one, but everything else really didn't make a mark on me, especially compared to some of the other boss fights from some of the other games that like I definitely think about when I think about this series.
I'm actually quite disappointed in thinking about it. It actually reminds me a lot of God of War 1, which didn't really only had 2 to speak of, Ares and the giant metal bull, and then the Kraken at the beginning of the game, or Hydra, I should say. Kind of interesting that those 2 sort of related. But really, Ascension reuses a lot of boss fights between the Furies.
Yeah.
Because the game opens up and you kill the first Fury. It wasn't Megara or Tisiphone. And I only know these names because of Hades by Supergiant now. So I know more about the Furies because of that game than Ascension. Anyway, you kill it, but then because the game's in a flashback, you fight her again twice. Mm-hmm. And then the middle one, you fight numerous times. And then the last one, you only fight at the final boss fight. So I really wasn't a fan of reusing the Furies over and over again, especially knowing that I had already killed one of them in the opening hour of the game.
Yeah, they kept showing back up, and I was like, wait, what is going on? Like, I knew they were jumping around in time, but it was still like, what point in time are we in now? Mm-hmm. I forget. Are we... yeah.
And then, like you said, the prophet guy, Pollux and Castor. So that was an interesting fight, at least 2 phases, kind of. One was more physical, one was more magical.
Yeah.
And then there's
some like dragons.
The arm, like the head of concrete or whatever it was called, the arm.
To start the game.
And honestly, I think that's the coolest fight in the game.
Yeah.
Because of the scale and spectacle of it. But really, you only fight, I guess, the 3 Furies and the prophet guy.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think of, again, we have some context, but just when you think of God of War 2 and 3, there are a lot of boss fights in those games. I mean, they're essentially boss fight games. And I feel like, I guess we have to, even 2018 may not have as many boss fights, but it's definitely more memorable.
I think the opening boss fight of that game is one of the best boss fights probably ever.
Yeah, like that's immediately iconic and
yes,
just stands.
Like there are fewer boss fights in that game, but the ones they include are great.
But there's also the dragon, and then the brothers, Migny and Modi. Yeah. Like there's them, and it's just, and then the final fight. This was actually really disappointing. I was looking forward to this game because of it's a PS3 game, so it's a bigger spectacle, more all this stuff. And I remember the opening of the game.
Yeah.
It turns out really the highlight of boss fights was the beginning of the game, and the rest kind of just petered out. The final fight, super big spectacle, narratively makes no sense, was a cakewalk. Like, it just felt weird.
Attack this giant tentacle, repeat it. Okay. Like,
yeah, it just... Yeah. They did not nail the boss fights, which I think is so essential to God of War's identity.
I guess the one other aspect of God of War that's pretty much in all the games. Did the puzzles do anything for you really in this one? Most of them really didn't for me. There were some cool sections, like once you got the time amulet thing, I mean, there was some, I think that was a cool idea, but I don't know how much they really did with it. I don't know. Like the puzzles that are here, I wouldn't have wanted them to be any harder or more difficult, I guess is what I'm saying. I wouldn't have wanted anything more intricate than what they gave us, but also what was there, I didn't really like I figured out what to do in most of them, and it was just kind of plotting to actually do that. But then again, maybe that's most puzzles in a lot of games, if I'm being honest.
It was they were very one-dimensional in the sense, like the time amulet that you get in the Delphi temple, or the smoke, I guess, the fog or whatever that you have to breathe.
Oh, yeah.
Every solution is find a crack in the door and break it so you can go through this hole, or like do something in the future that impacts the past, or vice versa, do something in the past that will impact the future year.
Yeah.
Like they didn't go deeper or flesh it out. And by the time they exhausted pretty much the fundamentals of it, you moved on and you never went back to it. Except for maybe a couple of times. I did not care for the Timey-Wimey ones where you had to like stop halfway through time.
Yes, I hated those.
Because you never solved it on your own, and the game
would always just say,
immediately prompts you and do it.
Yep.
Like, so what was the point of it? Then the clone, or like the stand-in, again, very flat.
That was just very simple most of the time.
Hold a lever, stand on a button. Like, there was no... It was actually way cooler in combat, like being able to send it out to fight other things. So I wish there was more, but it just was flat.
The coolest part of that implementation, I thought, was like that you could use that to like shake off buffs, but they only introduced that in the final boss fight of the whole game, because she would shoot you with black tar stuff or whatever, and then you could like create a clone, and the clone would like be the one to take that hit or whatever, and you could continue on. I don't know how it really worked in practice, but I just know that was like a way to,
it didn't make any sense to me at all.
It was just a way
it was
to
a cool cinematic moment.
It was like a way to cleanse yourself of the goop that was on you. But yeah, it doesn't make much sense because he's using the thing to create a clone of himself. He's not using it to stand in for him, I guess. I don't know. It's a video game. I guess they can change the rules on the fly. Let's talk about some aesthetic stuff before we kind of start wrapping up here. Did the music do much for you in this one? Because this I was trying to pay more attention to it this time around and see if there's anything that would really stick with me, but nope. It just kind of felt like, let's hit those same sort of beats we've been hitting in the series up to this point. Let's throw that main theme in there a whole bunch, and some window dressing around it. Like, I can't think of a single song in this game outside of the main theme that I can think of at all, to be honest.
When I was playing the game, so you and I went in the game with the same mentality of really try and like pick up on the music here. And I think we did that because of our discussion around the music in God of War 1. So I came in pretty intentional like you. You can hum the theme. The only song that I noticed during the gameplay was this song that played in the furnace, and you could hear with the beat, and maybe it's not even in the song, maybe it was just an environmental sound effect, but with the beat you could hear like a hammer on an anvil, like
yeah.
I was like, oh, that's kind of cool, incorporating those sounds into the music. I did go back after the game. This soundtrack is available on Apple Music and Spotify. It was actually part of the game if you pre-ordered it or whatever. So I listened to the soundtrack, and I had 3 songs that I wrote down. Ghost of Kira, which is the first village that you go through, has that Egyptian desert vibe to it that I brought up earlier, which I thought was interesting. So that was kind of cool to hear later. And then Warrior's Truth is the God of War 1 theme. Okay. Kind of amplified up a little bit. And then the rest of them, some sounded cool, like Temple Carnage, but I couldn't tell you when it played. I guess it played in a temple, so maybe the prophet. I don't know.
Yeah.
It was just, it wasn't iconic.
There are some tracks that I remember from other games in this series, and we'll get to those when we get to those. But the score in some of the moments from the other games is way more bombastic, and I feel like it really matches the moment quite well in some of the big scenes that are memorable from these games. I can't think of anything from this game that said with me. Like I said, I was trying to pay closer attention this time, so I would have something to say about it this time around. But
one more thing about the music. So again, I'm really trying to think about it, and it reminded me of this video, which will be in the show notes. It's from Every Frame a Painting. Are you familiar with that YouTube channel?
No.
It's this cinematic breakdown kind of guy. He used to make a lot of really cool videos. He doesn't do them anymore, but they're great. And one of the last videos that they made was it was called the Marvel Symphonic Universe. And he asked different people around. He's like, can you sing me a song from Indiana Jones, James Bond, Star Wars? Obviously, everyone can do that. And then he ends with the stinger, can you give me a song from the MCU? And no one can do it. And then he goes into this whole thing of like why that happens and how these types of decisions are made. And part of it was the music is just meant to be in the background and not noticed. Essentially, it was to a certain degree. It is meant to literally match what you were seeing on screen and the emotions you're supposed to feel, but not stand out. It is unintentional in that regard. And I feel like, especially this game, that was the goal, was for it to complement and not be unique and stand out. Like, they already had the God of War formula at this point. Like, it was just like, do this again.
I really feel like they were trying to emulate the first game a lot, which is why they kept folding in that main theme so much. At least I feel like that was very prominent. Maybe that was more prominent towards the end, but I can't recall anything Sorry, Tyler Bates. I apologize. Final thing before we close up here. Visual wise, I feel like this game looks like crap. I really do. I think this game looks terrible. I know it's a PS3 game, and I know it's a little bit old, and I'm sure I'm being more harsh on it in retrospect because I've gotten used to 4K and all this other fancy stuff for the past few years. I feel like this game looks washed the heck out. Like, it looks so devoid of color. I don't know if you felt the same way, but just very, very washed out. It looks like there was like a white filter placed over a lot of stuff in this game. It's like the inverse of a Snyder movie. So yeah, I don't know. Again, especially by comparison to what I'm remembering from 3 too, which I feel like has a fair amount of good like color mixing in it in the different sections of that game. This game just did not feel like that at all to me. It very much reflects the box art, I feel like.
Oh god, don't get me started on this old box art thing.
I mean, does it not though? Like, I feel like the box art was like very bright and white and yellowy, and I feel like the most of the color palette in this game is of that same style.
Yeah, it's very washy. Again, it's yellows and whites, very bright colors. It's not dark in any sense.
Yeah, but I feel like that was reflected in even a lot of like some of the boss designs and some of the character designs and things like that. Like, I like the opening hand monster thing you were talking about, whatever that's called, I forget. But I feel like that looks awful too. Like, I think its design is cool, but I think the way it actually looks in game with its character model was not great.
It's definitely not the most iconic. It just doesn't stand out, like, just visually, like,
even by comparison to the first game that we just played. I feel like that game had it had way more going on at way different areas of the game, whether it be going to the underworld or going to...
And the environments were memorable. They were different colors and bright or dark and had different designs. And this...
Everything just feels very samey.
It felt almost too realistic to a certain degree. Like they tried to make God of War grounded in a way instead of being more mythological and fanciful.
Yeah.
I guess the closest really you get to is maybe at the top of the Apollo statue where you go through time and it's like, it looks different and it's cool and gold and stuff.
Yeah.
This game, fun fact, is technically, like on a actual technical level, the worst visually God of War game. It is 720p instead of 1080. And it is an uncapped frame rate that rarely goes above 30. It is a really bad frame rate time. I was actually quite jarred by it coming through. Even I was looking it up here very briefly. Even God of War 3, so an earlier PS3 game, uncapped frame rate, but seems to be based off this Digital Foundry video pretty consistently in the like mid 40s to 50s. So it's even a higher frame rate there. In God of War 3, as we'll get to, definitely has a better, I think, visual design than this. So I don't know what happened to the single player game, but this 720p is not running all that great. It's a bummer. Sure, the PSP games run on PSP, but those were remastered for PS3 and they run at 1080 60. So it's actually quite disappointing, both on a technical and visual design element.
One quick thing I wanted to mention, just because I thought it was funny, because I had the Wikipedia page here pulled up next to me, just to get some, which is what we normally do when we do these. Anyway, the final line of like the intro of Ascension on the Wikipedia page, it says, Ascension sold less than its predecessors and received no awards, but it did receive several nominations, including Outstanding Achievement in Video Game Writing at the Writers Guild of America Video Game Awards.
What?
Huh?
What?
Must have been a weak year. Must have not had any good stories to pull from with The Last of Us and BioShock Infinite.
Okay.
I'm being sarcastic.
Are you kidding me?
No, I'm being sarcastic, but like that's
2013
really funny.
was a god tier year for that.
Yeah, it's very funny to see that would have been nominated alongside those other games. Those other games surely were the winners. I know some people think the story of Infinite is trash. I still like that story, but
I like it too.
I guess wrapping up here, God of War Ascension, not a great God of War game. Yeah, I feel like it just feels so weird. Like, it feels so uninspired in a lot of ways. I feel like I do agree that the aspects that were probably the most inspired with this game came with the multiplayer, but then they just slapped this quick story together that was just very clear that they needed to not do another Greek game, and they did another Greek game, and they did another prequel. And I guess the one thing I didn't mention before too is that it doesn't even feel like Kratos is in this game. Sometimes it just feels like you're controlling a man who has chain blades and he's running around, because he barely talks in this game. Like, he is so devoid of any sort of character or usual traits of Kratos. Like, he's not even screaming in this game very much. He doesn't do anything. He's just kind of guy with weapons fighting monsters and stuff. Like, he only talks a couple times throughout the whole game.
I totally agree with you. And actually, I found this line from the God of War fandom wiki page kind of interesting. I think it's reflective of it. It's basically, he's talking about he's killed his wife and child. Quote, however, Kratos, enraged and saddened by the accidental killing, became a self-pitying recluse, unable to forgive himself for his crime, and adamantly vowing never to serve Ares again, end quote. So Kratos is clearly depressed, and he's not out to kill Ares yet, as we learn, because he takes 10 years to actually get to that point, apparently.
Why is he depressed? Because he doesn't even remember till the very end, and he's like, oh, yes, I killed my family, no!
Yeah, it's just, he's clearly quiet, and it's not...
It's because I don't think they had anything to explore his character with, and that's the problem, is that by the time they got to 3, I feel like they had fully fleshed out his arc. And by going back and doing this, I feel like they didn't want to potentially undo anything that they felt like they had closed the book on with 3. So they're like, okay, we'll go back and we'll do a prequel, but we can't mix up too much because we like where he's at a good spot further down the road, and we don't want to undo that somehow with a it's very... I almost would have been more fine if this game was totally just a God of War game where he's like, yo, Ares, I'm rocking with you. Let's go kill some people. Like, that would have been 10 times better if you were just like...
That would have been interesting.
A brutal, like, murderous Kratos who is a very much not good guy when you play as him.
That could have been interesting. At least, I think that this game... When I think about this game now, you know, the initial stuff, like, it's a multiplayer. Haha, wow, not a great idea for God of War. This game, I think, really, really, really put the pressure on
them to
what would become God of War 2018.
For them to reboot it. Like, this really prompted us to be like, okay, stop. You need to do something else.
Yeah, it really... And that pressure ultimately paid off, you know? And we'll talk about it when we get to 2018, but the fact that it is all canonical, it is all tied together. Like, they didn't restart. They didn't scratch everything and just say new Kratos, new world. Like, everything connects. Even this. Even God of War Betrayal, the mobile game, which I want to play, but you don't want to.
No, thank you.
And I respect that. But in this game, almost, again, hindsight's 2020, but without this game, I don't... God of War 2018 still would have been an achievement, but I feel like it is more so because this is what preceded it. And I kind of like that, you know?
Yeah. It's I don't know. As a whole, this is an interesting entry in the larger series. It's one that was not the best by any means, but I think it also allowed them to kind of go back to the drawing board. So I think in some senses it's I don't think they would have done another Greek game after this, regardless of it. I think it could have been more successful than even like 3 or better well received, and I still don't think they would have done another Greek game after this. But this game being pretty bland and dismal, I think really did push them in the right direction for the reboot. So by that account, it's probably important, but not important in the way that you would think.
Yes.
So yeah. Did you have anything else you wanted to say about Ascension here?
It's a fascinating game.
It's one of the 3 prequels. So 2 more left.
Yeah, and it's a game stuck in time, especially when the servers get shut off. Like it'll always be a part of God of War, but it won't necessarily be the most fondest one.
It's very much the one that I think is the least favorite in the series, to be honest. Even more so than the handheld games, because I don't think people dislike those necessarily. They're a little smaller in scale because they had to be on the PlayStation Portable, PSP baby. But I think people like those games more, and those were more well received. This is the one that people look back on. They're like, no, don't really like this one. And so it seems like our consensus is pretty similar now, nearly, like you said, 8-9 years later. But yeah, cool. That does it for episode 2 of Chapter Select here. So we will be back next time around with obviously episode 3, which is going to be on God of War 2. So we are doing the second entry in the series, which is widely considered one of the best. We'll see if that still holds up 15 years later. When did that come out? 2005 or 6? I think 6, honestly.
No, 2005 was the first game.
Okay.
So
I think 6 then. I think 4 was the first game, if I'm correct. But
we just did an episode on it, buddy. 2005.
It was 2005?
Was God of War 1, yeah.
So wait, when
God
did
of War 2 came out in 2007.
That was, wow.
March 13th, which is the same.
It's surprising for some reason.
A lot of these games came out in March.
That's very surprising for some reason. I don't know why. I knew that game came out after the PlayStation 3, but I thought it came out before, and then the PS3 launched. I forgot that it straight up launched after the PS2.
Yes. Shuhei Yoshida.
Anywho,
he made that call.
The first Cory Barlog game. That'll be what we do next time, and we will have a guest on that episode as well. If you would like a tease in that regard. So we'll have a third person joining us to talk through God of War 2 and see how we feel about it all these years later. Until that time, though, thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to keep following along with us, you can follow Max and myself on Twitter. I am at moreman12. Max is at Max Roberts 143. You can also follow the show now on Twitter at Chapter Select, right? We did get that?
Yep, we got it.
Okay, cool. We did. Thank you for the man who gave us that at. Because I know we had to ask for that. So at Chapter Select, you can also follow the podcast now, and we'll be tweeting out when things go live and future updates and things like that. But yeah, that should be everything for this episode. And we'll see you back here next time with episode 3. Until then, have a good evening, week, whatever it might be, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Adios. Chapter Select is a Max Frequency production. This episode was research, produced, and edited by me, Max Roberts. Season 2 is hosted by Logan Moore and myself, and it's all about God of War. For more on this season, go to chapterselect.com/season 2. To check out previous seasons, go to chapterselect.com.